Hello and welcome to Morgan Meets the Eye. My name is Evan Morgan and I'm the host of the series. First things first, I want to thank you all for tuning in. And I do want to encourage you to follow me on social media. My Twitter handle is at NotSpicedRum and my Instagram handle is at some guy named Morgan. So make sure to subscribe to my YouTube page and certainly keep up with the show on Apple, Spotify, or upon whichever streaming platforms it is available. So right off the bat, I do want to give a warm welcome to my guest for the day, Elijah Gizzarelli. He was the Libertarian Party of Rhode Island's nominee for governor during the 2022 midterms. His campaign spread the message of libertarianism to a wider audience, and if our current system worked at all, he would have been elected Rhode Island's next governor. So needless to say, I'm pretty excited to have him here, and thanks for coming on the show, Elijah.
Thanks for having me, Evan.
Okay, so first things first, what was the overall message, you were trying to convey during this election, and what was the main goal you wanted to accomplish?
Well, first and foremost, I wanted to win, right? That's really the campaigns, but I would settle for just being able to show some people the farce that was going on between the Republicans and Democrats running against each other. And my main message was just common sense, right? And so I was really trying to talk about basic common sense issues everybody can agree on from across the spectrum and show how both Republicans and Democrats refuse to fix these problems within our system. And so the main topic I talked about the most, given the limited amount of time I had in front of voters, was ending the drug war, right? And so the ending the drug war just makes so much sense. It's completely backed up by not just theoretical numbers and data, but we have empirical evidence from other places that have totally ended their drug war, and the success stories that we've seen from Portugal, from even Oregon, right? So just having all that data backing up that argument and the perpetuation of the drug war just doesn't make any sense. And then when you can show voters that, they really start to say, right? And you're not just, if you don't just stand on platitudes like nobody should be put in prison, like it's true. Nobody should be put in prison for choices they make on their own body. But when you start backing that up with numbers and the actual cost of what we do, right? Then people start like really thinking, oh, wow. Even the most conservative people think, maybe this isn't such a good idea.
Right, exactly. I think Rhode Island, and for that matter, the United States as a whole, has, obviously fallen short of these goals. And that kind of leads me to my next question, which is, why do you think things are the way they are? They're very bureaucratic, inefficient, and to an extent, I would say just really unjust, the way our system works. And it seems that any attempt to really rectify these core issues is quickly just put down or, shot down, or at the very least, people who tend to go against these things are kind of dismissed as being, melodramatic or, exaggerated or what have you, or just overly idealistic is probably, I would say, the most common. But what I'm asking is that, yes, we can point out, what's wrong with our society, but how do you think they got that way in the first place?
Wow, I could probably talk like for 5 hours on one question, because it's not anybody who tries to say it's specifically for this reason, right? I would not buy that argument. I would have to really listen to their points, and I would probably be able to pick it apart in 2 seconds. Now, I have my own suspicions I lean on more heavily, but there's a wide range of reasonable conclusions somebody can come to, right? So I would say corruption would be like the number one, right? Is that if you give power to people, right, they're going to abuse that power, even incidentally, right? Like sometimes you don't try to abuse power that you have, but you abuse it anyway, right?
Right, yes.
Right, so if you study any kind of psychology, we have so many self-serving biases, right? That you can't help. Even the most well-intentioned person in the world cannot help but abuse their power based off of these self-serving biases. And so we could talk about self-serving biases like for a long time. That's its own paper in and of itself, right? But yeah, that corruption. That's why power corrupts, right? And people say that, people believe that, but then for some reason, when we talk about government, which is basically where all the power in the world lies, people start like they put on their blinders, like, oh, not the government. And it's like, wait, what? Like, you think power only corrupts government officials in the past? And it's kind of weird, this weird scenario we get into, right? So that's number one, I think. I think that's probably the main cause. Another thing is fear, right? Like it or not, government, and some libertarians might argue with me on this, but government is downstream from culture, right? And if enough people are scared and we live in fear of one another, then when you're scared of something, you want to control it, right? If you have like a little puppy, right, that's like adorable and nobody thinks it's going to bite anybody, like nobody's like, hey, you need to go put that puppy in a cage, right? But let's say you have an equally like docile Rottweiler, right? People are going to be like, hey, you should have a muzzle on that thing. Or, hey, you need to put that thing in the kennel. Like, I don't want to come into your house if that thing's out, right? And so what happens is that fear, right, it makes us treat things differently. Even though the Rottweiler has done nothing wrong, we approach it with fear and with caution. We try to cage it up. And it's this fear that drives us to try to control each other, right? Whenever somebody talks about why we need the government, they're never talking about for themselves. They're always talking about because other people might do crazy stuff, right? Meanwhile, like, I forget, there was some study, I don't even know if I believe it or something. Somebody like posited something, I forget. It's kind of old. It was pretty famous though. It was like the average American commits like 3 felonies a day or something like that. I forget what the actual thing was. I don't know if I even believe that, but it makes a point, right? That like, that's like, everybody breaks the law. You're not going to tell me you don't speed. You're not going to tell, like, you break the law all the time. You only want the law enforced on other people, right? Because it's a way of people, like, as humans, like human beings grew up controlling our environment. We are the best species at controlling our environment, which is why we're at the top of the food chain. And so government has become this false, kind of like this, I'm trying to get the wording right here. The image in my mind is right, but it's become this way that people believe that they can control others, but they don't realize that they have absolutely no control over the government, right? Like all the control that they have over the government is completely like superficial. You honestly, you can't even tell me that you have confidence in election results. Like you can't tell me like, I know for a fact that all the people that voted got their votes counted, and like you can't because you have no control over that, right? Like you have to just completely take it on faith that all the people are doing all the right thing, and so even that small modicum of control you think that you have over the government doesn't even exist, and so it's this illusion of control over the government. Meanwhile, you're the one being controlled by it. And so it's this weird paradox where the people that actually do control the government, the people that are in power, and that's not necessarily the politicians, by the way, they want to believe that you have control over the government so that you will try to use the government to solve your problems and to lessen your fears of other people. And the more you do that, the more control they gain over you. And so, so those would be the two biggest things. There are like literally 50 other factors that we could talk about how everything snowballed out of control. Like you could talk about the two-party system and how that came to be. this is a crazy thing a lot of people haven't thought about, but Thomas Jefferson actually created the two-party system by accident, right? So if we can talk about that if you want. Like, there are so many ways. There are so many ways, right? That like, we've gotten to this point, but it's spiraling out of control, right? Even for the people that are in control, like it's gotten really crazy. Trump got elected. I mean, everything's going.
Yeah, essentially. I mean, in a way, you know, I'm actually kind of happy with the growing distrust in, you know, our democratic system, because, you know, now that I'm seeing people saying, you know, the 2016 election was, you know, Russian interference, or the 2020 election was illegitimate. It's like we're seeing people growing more and more distrustful of the government, and I think in a way that's going to work in, you know, more of a libertarian's, you know, favor, really. I mean, I feel like the less people trust the government, the less loyal they're going to be to it, and the better off people would be that way.
Yeah, I mean, that is a feature of what's been going on, and it's we're lucky that the people have been so inept at instilling that trust, right? Because it says in the Declaration of Independence, I'm probably not going to get the exact quote, so somebody's going to like make fun of me in the comments or something. But it says something along the lines like people are more prone to suffering when sufferances are sufferable, or something like that. I don't think they use the word suffering so many times in a row, but that's like the point, right? So they actually kind of allude to that. It's like this king has been so egregious that like if he was just like a little bit less and we could like suffer through it, then we'd just be chilling. But it's become completely insufferable, and so now we have to do something. And so and that's part of like what they try to do, like the people that have control, have their hands in the pies, right? What they try to do is they try to make things not so bad. They try to bribe you with luxuries, with like nice things, so that when you do see the corruption, when you see the terrible things going on, when you see genocides in Yemen, you just kind of choose to look the other way, right? So, you know, like I got an iPhone, it doesn't matter if there are nets outside the windows, I want whatever. Like, yeah, you know, like, and so we get kind of bribed with luxury in order to keep the status quo. It's sad, but it's true.
Yes, that's very, you know, very truly said. And it actually kind of makes me think of, you know, I know the economist, you know, Franz Oppenheimer, he was writing about, you know, the conquest theory of state formation, where he was breaking down essentially how the state originates, not out of, you know, necessity, not out of people, you know, in primitive society saying, oh, we need a state to govern us. In reality, what happened was that, you know, certain groups of people would take over the land, and then they would create their state and essentially force it on the people of that land. And that's basically how the state originated. So I feel like that's an interesting, you know, response to people who insist that, you know, the state was created because, you know, people needed to evolve, you know, to a higher level, and then that's where the government came in, when in reality, I mean, his findings kind of go against that.
Yeah, it's funny. Some people like to say that taxation is the price we pay to live in a civilized society. And I put a little spin on that. I say, no, taxation is the price we pay for not being a civilized society. Oh. Right? and that's the thing, right? Is so anytime we use the government, right? Anytime we're using the government, peace has failed, right? Government in and of itself, everything the government does is backed up by threats of violence or actual violent acts, right? Which happen often. Usually, though, the violent acts are just put in place to make sure everybody knows, hey, we will do this, right? Like, you only need to arrest Ross Albright to really mess up an entire market of people. Okay, I don't want that, right? Like you just need to make an example out of one guy, of one person, and then you can be like, you see what happens, right? I went to basic training with Chelsea Manning, right? You just need to arrest the one person, and then be like, oh, don't tell anybody that we're lying about casualties in Afghanistan, or else you'll go to federal prison. You'll be sentenced for life, right? And then when Obama commuted Chelsea Manning's sentence, right? It was just a few years later, back in prison because she refused to testify against Julian Assange. And she didn't even refuse to testify against Julian Assange. She refused to testify against Julian Assange in a shadow court. She said, I will testify only if the proceedings are made public. And so they put her back in prison indefinitely. I actually haven't followed the situation, but as far as I know, she's still in bars, behind bars right now, because they said you're going to be in bars until you testify, right? So just like that, they said, "Oh, if you refuse to play ball, we can put you in prison forever, right? Just because you don't want to testify against somebody. It's crazy."
Right. They run essentially like the mafia, with their illegitimacy. I mean, out of curiosity, how did you get into libertarianism? Did you evolve into this ideology over the years, or have you just always considered yourself one?
No, actually, I was pretty much, I've kind of done the whole political spectrum now. I just figured libertarianism was the last one on the thing, and so I'd get to that event. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, when I was a kid, right, I was like a lot more liberal, right? I didn't know anything about anything. I just, I thought that we should be nice to people. And that to me was liberalism, I guess. And and I think that that's actually where a lot of people that consider themselves liberals are. Is they just think, oh, well, we should be nice to people. And I'm like, yeah, I used to think that too. I mean, I still think that we should be nice to people. I just don't associate that with any political ideology now. But well, I guess you can't really be nice to people and not a libertarian. But I'm not going to get into that. Anyway,
right, that's very, very true.
Yes. I kind of was I had like these weird ideas. Like I remember like telling my dad, I was like, I don't think that you should be able to inherit anything. Like I think that as soon as you die, all your property should become government property. Like and then, yeah, like I like it's just silly, stupid stuff. Like like I was thinking like Paris Hilton was really popular then. And
right.
Useless, like and then and then I joined the army. I joined the army because there was like a kind of neocon thing. And by the way, neocons are liberals, so it's not that far of a jump. And
take that, Ben Shapiro.
Yeah, neocons are liberals. And we saw that actually with Trump, right? Suddenly, all these neocons started like really opposing Trump ending wars, right? And they start just totally trying to help out Democrats, right? And that's actually, I think, things that happened with like the McCains. Who else? That guy from Fox News, I forgot his name. I think it was Chris something.
Chris,
I forget his name. But like like Fox News started like shilling for Biden. Like, it was like pretty crazy because they're owned by the military-industrial complex, and Trump was worse for the military-industrial complex than Biden would have been. So, but anyway, I digress. So I kind of became a neocon. Then I still had like this strong like be nice to people kind of thing mixed in with my neocon. Like I thought that I support the war in Iraq because Saddam was such a bad guy. And it's that has not changed, right? Saddam was a terrible guy. That doesn't mean that we should have invaded Iraq.
Right, exactly.
Died due to that invasion, right? And it's like just because Saddam's a bad guy doesn't mean that we should like destroy an entire nation. in order to
Right.
stop that guy. Hint, hint, Russia. Anyway, so
Yeah.
so then it was like the 2012 election. I decided to actually pay attention to politics and watch the debates. And I was watching the Republican primaries, and Ron Paul was the only guy on stage that really seemed to be making any logical sense. Everybody else was being very politician-y, very dodging questions. Ron Paul had like his stuff just was like linear logic. Like he was just making sense. Like he was backing up what he was saying. He was talking about blowback. Everything that he said kind of lined up. And then I could actually Google afterwards what he was talking about, the Federal Reserve and all this stuff, right? And I started learning a lot, right? And it kind of started with Austrian economics. And then it kind of blossomed into, I just kind of had fun looking up conspiracy theories for a while. And then, not really believing a lot of them, but just kind of, I started doing that as kind of a pastime. As I was in the Army, so I didn't have anything else to do. So just YouTube conspiracy theories. And then it was probably about 6 months before I really became a hardcore libertarian. I remember scratching and clawing my way there, right? Because emotionally, I loved the government emotionally. I just did. And even though I could logically tell you why big government didn't work, or I could there was something emotionally I'd always be, but there's, what if, and I would just have all these, and then eventually, I remember the moment that libertarianism really clicked for me was when Fukushima happened, right? So there was this big nuclear disaster. There was a tsunami in Fukushima. There was a nuclear power plant there.
Yes.
Yeah. And so the United States sent a aircraft carrier group over there to help. I remember just thinking, you see, this is why, no other country can do what we're doing right now to help them. We have aircraft carriers. This is how good, we can be. And then I just start thinking about all the money that they stole from people in order to build that aircraft carrier. And then how much, how the creation of that aircraft carrier was not to help people in Fukushima. It was to perpetuate the military-industrial complex, and how much pain and suffering that military-industrial complex demands as a matter of fiscal responsibility in order to have an aircraft carrier, right? And then I realized, I was like, even though sometimes, a bad guy can do something good, so that doesn't change the fact that they're a bad guy, right? And so I realized, I was like, that aircraft carrier, just the existence of it represents so much human suffering. Yeah, because what? They gave some people some warm beds and some blankets, that erases all the suffering, right, from that aircraft carrier represents. And that's when I realized, that's when libertarianism really clicked for me.
I had a pretty similar trajectory myself. I growing up, I didn't really care much about politics. And then when I got to college, back around 2015, 2016, back when I was 19 or 20 and kind of naive at that point, I was a Bernie Sanders supporter. And, even to this day, I do think, Bernie has a way of looking at issues that are in society, and I think there's some value to that, but I think the solutions he then turns around and proposes, are only going to make the problem, much, much worse. And so, that kind of went on for a while. I kind of leaned towards that. And, I supported Andrew Yang and his policy of universal basic income. And then, and I thought, right. Yeah, I know. That's right.
That was the best
Make America think harder.
Of all time. I'm sorry. Even though I didn't agree with it, it was still great.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And then when the pandemic happened and I found myself kind of laid off from my job, and it was like, well, what do I do now? I ended up reading Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, and that book really, kind of changed the way I looked at things. 'Cause it explained how, the government, for example, they could come along and they can build, let's say, a bridge or something, and what they've done is they've taken, millions of dollars of taxpayer money to build that bridge, but people see the government doing that, and it's like, the government built that, they created that, and because we see that bridge, we don't see that, all the other, things that the money that was directed towards that bridge could have gone to. We don't see, all the goods that could have been made in the private sector. We don't see all of that. And as a result, that tends to take a higher priority because people will always focus on what's immediately perceptible to them right now, rather than having the imagination to actually see what could have been otherwise.
And I don't have the numbers for the story, so forgive me. But there was a story. It was pretty famous. It was national news at one point. This guy, they were going to build a stairway in a park, like going up a hill. And their plans for it was $60,000, right? And so a guy that lived in the town saw the plans, like flipped his shit, and then like went down and spent $650 of his own money and just built the stairwell. Right, and then and then the town ripped out the stairway that he built, and there was such public backlash from it. They were like, "Oh, okay, we couldn't keep his stairway because we weren't sure if it was built properly with all the regulations and everything." They're like, "But we hear you. We're not going to spend $60,000," and they actually ended up spending something like $15,000. But which is still a travesty. But like the whole point that they were able to cut out, like, and I think that they might have been a little bit lower than 15,000. Again, my numbers aren't great on this one. It's a story that's in the back of my mind. But like they were able to cut like at least 75% of the costs just because that guy went and did that. Like, and it's like that's an open admission, right? That they were being corrupt as like hell. Like they knew that they were just stealing taxpayer money and giving it to their friends, right? They knew that they were giving so much, right? And it's just like, come on, if there's that one example of that, imagine how many other things that are going on. Right? How many other things, how many other ways is the government taking your money, misappropriating it? In Rhode Island, right? This is what I talked about a lot in my campaign. I said it costs us about $70,000 a year to house one inmate, right? That number was actually on the low spectrum. The number is actually closer to $90,000 a year, right? It's absolutely insane. The average Rhode Islander makes $35,000 a year, right? How is it twice as expensive or 3 times as expensive to be a prisoner in Rhode Island than to live the average lifestyle? It's absolutely insane. Where is that money going, right? It doesn't make any sense. There's we could be feeding these prisoners caviar and foie gras every day. That's not what they get, by the way. And it still would not cost that much money. It makes no sense, right? You have to at least make it make sense. And so that's why I talked about a lot during my campaign was I would just point out certain examples where the math didn't add up. I was a big fan of that Andrew Yang chant. So I really want to talk about math during my campaign because we all know how exciting math is to voters.
Yes. Oh yeah, yeah. We've seen that. So I mean that kind of brings me to another question. I mean you're talking about your drug policy and how you want to essentially definitely work on that whole aspect. So I've noticed, and while I definitely agree with that, I've noticed that as bad as the system is, there's, a large portion of the population that gets a bit squeamish around the topic of drug legalization. And I think a lot of their discomfort really comes down to the fact that they don't really understand what drug legalization entails or drug, decriminalization. So, in the most painstakingly, specific terms, what exactly would you do to reform this?
Well, I mean, honestly, as governor, it would be very easy. I would, like I said on my campaign, I would pardon all nonviolent drug offenders day one, right? And I would continue to pardon any nonviolent drug offenders so long as police continue to arrest them in the state. And eventually, police will just stop doing that. And it doesn't matter what the legislature has to say about it, right? There are other things you could really do if I really wanted to be like hot-headed governor and take on the state, but I don't want to be the emperor of Rhode Island, right? And so I don't even have to get into that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think just that one act of releasing nonviolent drug offenders. Now, a few people have been wise enough to see a danger in that statement. People will say, well, what about people who like cut their supply with things like fentanyl and then sold it to people and then people died? I would say that that's murder, right? That's not non-violent,
Yes.
right? And so those people should have been tried for murder. If they weren't, I don't know what to tell you, but like, no, that's not a non-violent thing, right? If you poison somebody on purpose, like if I put something inside your drink, right, that you did not ask me to put in there and you die from it, I'm going to go to jail for murder, right? And it shouldn't matter whether it's your drink or it's your bag, your 8-ball or whatever the terms these kids use these days for these drugs, right? Like, it doesn't matter. I know I look like I do a lot of drugs. I actually have no idea. Like I don't use drugs recreationally. I like to be in control of my body. I've tried some drugs. I'm not going to like pretend like I haven't, right? But I don't like them.
Right.
And I don't suggest most people do them.
Right. I hear that. Yeah, I'm a straight edge guy myself. You know, no smoking, no drinking, no nothing. You know, I often say no smoke. No, I don't smoke cigarettes. I don't smoke marijuana. I don't smoke salmon. I don't smoke anything. But you know, but I oh yeah, it is quite good. Yeah, I'd probably be missing out on that area, but you know, I'm somebody who I would consider myself, you know, I'm just going to let the cat out of the bag and say that I would consider myself a Rothbardian anarcho-capitalist, and one of the core tenets of this economic and social ideology is, you know, the non-aggression principle, or the NAP. Now, if somebody decides to, you know, put drugs into their own body, you know, they're not aggressing against anybody else. And I mean, the fact that the state, you know, prioritizes these purely self-contained drug offenses where they're not hurting other people over other crimes, which I think are much more severe in hurting other people, you know, I think that's very telling. You know, it goes to show that the state doesn't really care about, you know, individual rights. You know, they're more concerned about other things. You know, I mean, they don't really care about the non-aggression principle or, you know, any topic such as that, because the very nature. Right, exactly, yeah. You know, the very nature, the essence, you know, the function of the state is to use force and to aggress against others. So it's like, you know, it only goes to show that that's how their policies are going to punish people as well. And I mean, you were saying yourself earlier, you know, about how, you know, we have so much money going towards like these people in prison, and, you know, I mean, the prisons are already so overcrowded, and the fact that people are going to prison over such stupid things to begin with, I mean, I feel like that's, you know, that only underscores the, you know, the severity of that situation. So, and this may, you know, exceed the scope of, you know, Rhode Island's, you know, governor's position, but, I mean, you know, what are your personal views on the United States, you know, military policy?
So, I have no problem talking about national politics. I do want to kind of go back before we get into that question. So I would implore you, right? I like Rothbard and everything. He was not good at marketing, I would say. And I would say anarcho-capitalist is probably one of the worst labels anybody could possibly ascribe to themselves, right? It's like, I don't know what he was thinking. Like, he was like, oh, okay, we'll say capitalist, so half the population hates it immediately. And then we'll say anarchist,
exactly.
so the exact other half of the population hates it immediately.
Right.
And then we'll try to get
exactly.
to be it. Doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So, check out my my cool shirt here.
Oh, nice. Now that's a Yeah, that's a term I can get behind.
Yeah.
You know. I'm loving that logo too.
Yeah. And
Oh,
so
that's
I
nice.
even stopped for a while. I used to call myself an anarchist, but unfortunately, there's a lot of connotations to that word that,
Right.
that people don't realize, right? And so most of society thinks of anarchy as being really hard left, right?
Right. No
Really hard.
hierarchies.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the thing. Like, so I like voluntarist better because I'm not really an anarchist. Um,
Right.
Now, in the anarcho-capitalist arguments, yes, you would define me as an anarcho-capitalist, right? You could define me as that. But the thing is, I believe that government could exist as long as it's voluntary. And we can see voluntary things that we don't typically call government, but they act as a form of organization. And so when you say anarchist to a lot of people, it gives them a lot of anxiety, right? They think it's just chaos, right? And so I choose not to use those words because it doesn't really describe, not like, because I was a translator in the army, right? And so when you're a hammer, everything you see is a nail, right? And so as a translator, whenever there's like a discrepancy, I always see it as like a problem in communication. And if you think about the political spectrum, each segment of the political spectrum almost has its own vocabulary. It has its own language. They ascribe different meanings to different words. And so if you're like a mission, if you're like on a mission, if you're like a missionary, right? If you want to see libertarianism or political activism in that light, like Mormons, they go to all these different countries, right? But first they learn the language of the country that they're going to. And so if you want to talk to other people on your mission, you should learn to speak their language. And so I would implore anybody, right, if you are going to try to convince people of things, think about how that person defines things. Think about the way that they speak of things. Understand their definitions. Don't try to force definitions down their throats. Right? Libertarians love to do that. They love to be like, you don't even know what socialism means. It's like, it doesn't matter what socialism means. Speak to them about their language, right? Like, what do they think socialism means? And then have a conversation around them. They don't have to adapt to you, not if you want to convince them of something, right? And so that was I just wanted to throw that out there. Now we can talk about
Definitely understand. Okay,
Uh,
sure. Yes.
Sorry about that.
No, I definitely get it. I mean, I consider I know the philosopher Alan Watts. I've seen some of his videos where he talks about, for example, the reality. Yeah, he's great. I mean, he talks about like the reality of what something is, what we call it, and I think anarcho-capitalism is definitely not the most optics-friendly, name for this ideology. But, I mean, I do look, also people such as Hans Hermann Hoppe who talk about, covenant communities and different setups like that I think have some validity to them as well.
And so here's the thing, too, is I really, just because we're talking about these thought leaders, right? Thought leaders are not Christ, right? Like there's no reason to think like everything this person has said or thought is 100% correct. Like I really, really like Rothbard, right?
Yeah.
I don't believe that parents should be able to sell their children. Right, like
Oh yeah,
like it's fine. He can be wrong sometimes. It wasn't like it was. By the way, it wasn't like anybody who tries to mischaracterize that. Like it wasn't like Rothbard was trying to socially engineer a society where he could sell his children. Right, like that's not what was going through his head. He was thinking about principles, and he was trying to figure out what that happens, right? Like what happens afterwards. If we accept this principle, then down the line, what does this mean, right? And you come to and while you're a thought leader, like he was working off of very little back work from other philosophers. So he was really on the cutting edge. You're not going to be right all the time, right? Same thing with Hans Hermann Hoppe. I have some serious problems with
Yeah.
some things that
Oh, yeah.
he posits, right?
Mhm.
But it's okay, right? Sometimes people are wrong. And it's important,
Absolutely.
especially when talking about philosophers, like people that are like literally cutting the edge, right? Like it's okay to not just freak out about one thing that they might have said. Like it's okay to
Of
just
course.
to listen to what they have to say. Some people have some really crazy ideas, and then just one idea is like, oh wow, that is interesting, right? And so I just wanted to throw that out there. Just if we're talking about those people, that's a point I feel like is like I feel like a lot of people feel like these people need to be like worshipped in a way, and I'm like, no, like it's okay.
Mhm.
You should
Right.
listen to what they have to say. You should understand it and throw out anything that doesn't make sense to you. It's okay to do
Of
that,
course.
right?
Right. Absolutely.
Um,
Evaluate ideas instead of people.
exactly. And again, like some people like just have some shitty ideas, right? And you should just throw
Yeah.
those old people out. Like it's fine, right? But you know, it's okay. I think I don't know who said this originally. It might just be like an old adage or something, but it's a mark of intelligence to be able to entertain an idea without accepting it, right? But yeah, I mean, I really think that that's important. Like in our society, politics has become so polarized that when somebody says something that you don't agree with, you immediately start jumping down their throat, right? And it's like, well, hold on a second. Hold on a second. Some people can be right about some things. Like I find a lot of people that are woke, right? I'm not a big fan of wokeness, right?
Right.
But I am a big fan of fairness and equality.
Of course. Yes. Yes.
And there are some things that some of even the craziest woke people that do things that I find despicable sometimes. They have ideas that are very important concepts to understand. And if you just never listen to these people because you disagree with what they said or they support critical race theory or something like that, you're missing out, right? Because there are diamonds in the rough in there sometimes that you can find that really, really help you like understand things. What was the postmodern thought, right? Like the people who came up with the postmodernism stuff, that's a very important concept for people to understand. And it's almost always applied incorrectly, right? And so when you read postmodernist like theories, they always sound like whack jobs, right? But the original postmodern concept of that, like you can that the human brain conceptualizes things and we put it into like buckets, right? And you can always change the bucket to suit your needs. That's totally true. And it will help you think about things in different ways if you read that and you learn. I'm not explaining it very well right now. And no, that doesn't mean that like, you know, I can identify as a dragon, right? That's not what that means, right? And somebody will write that, like, oh, if you're allowed to move your bucket, you know, it's like, no. But like the original idea is that, you know, we have to be flexible in how we categorize information in our brains. That's a very, very important idea that's integral to examining almost any kind of thought pattern. And the people that originally came up with postmodern theory, right, like, they really like flesh this out. It's a good read, right? That doesn't mean that you have to accept every single conclusion that's ever come from that theory, right? So don't just throw people's ideas out just because they said one thing that you think is stupid. But anyway, now let's talk about people that are really, really stupid, right? And that's the military-industrial complex.
Oh yeah. Excellent segue. Yeah.
It's a good segue. I had a segue like that, or else you'd never get that. Yeah. So, there was a general, Major General Smedley Butler, right? Have you heard of him? Yeah.
I have not actually.
No. Okay, you'll find this interesting. He's my go-to when talking about foreign interventionism. Right?
Okay.
Major General Smedley Butler is the most decorated Marine in Marine Corps history. He has 2 medals of honor and the Marine Brevet Medal, which is the highest medal the Marine Corps gives out. And he was a general. I feel like his commission started in the late 1800s. I could be wrong. Maybe it's early 1900s. I forget. But it's somewhere around there. He was a major general in like the 1930s.
Okay.
And basically, he wrote a book called "War is a Racket," right? And so he basically talks about how every theater he ever went to, his Marines were the tip of the spear, and then right after them wasn't the Army or the Navy or anybody else. It was always the bankers.
Oh, yeah.
And and so he talks about, like, East Asia, South America, like all these different theaters, right, of these wars that happened in the early 1900s, things that Americans don't even learn about in history class, right? Like, it was always to economically exploit the people that they were invading, right, or that they were messing with. And then he also talks about how, war is a racket because, like, Americans, the people that pay for these wars, think that it's to help them or to further liberty or something, always. And that's not true either. The whole thing's a racket. And so the most decorated Marine Corps Marine of all time is on record, like, wrote a whole book about the horrors of war and how you should never, ever support them. I think that he says that the only just war would be a war being fought on American soil. I don't remember his exact position on it. But that was basically his thing, was like, unless we're fighting on American soil, it's probably BS. Like,
Exactly.
that was
I know. It's like,
and
right, a lot of
also
interventionism.
I'm sorry, I think that there's a delay. What were you saying?
I'm sorry. There's just a lot of interventionism, in other affairs as well.
Yeah, and so, and again, he wrote that book, I think, in like 1936 or something. So that was like a good 20 years before Eisenhower, another general, 5-star general this time, coined the term military-industrial complex, right? Like, guys, these generals have been warning us about not to support these wars for 100 years. And we just haven't listened. And then there are some people that pretend like you're not patriotic or something if you talk out against these wars. And it's like, that's crazy. Like, some of the most decorated like soldiers of all time are the ones who started warning us about this to begin with. And so that's very, very important. Smedley Butler is also this other kind of crazy thing that happened. He testified in Congress in 1934 that he was approached by various CEOs from across the country. The CEO of General Electric, the CEO of Goodyear Tire, which was like a huge company back then. I don't know if they still are. A bunch of these people, they came to him and tried to hire him to perform a military coup and take FDR out of power. And he went along with it just long enough to get as many names as he possibly could on who was in on it. And then he brought it to Congress and was like, look, these people are trying to perform a coup here and set up a fascist government. And then Congress, like, I forget what they actually put in the congressional record, but it's something like they investigated it. They found Smedley Butler's statements to be true, and they just never did anything about it. Like, they investigated, found that he was telling the truth, like he had the proof, and then they just never. Then it just drops off the record. They just never did anything about it. Really crazy.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of Operation, I think it was Northwoods they called it, where I think back in the Kennedy administration, there was actual talk of, this is confirmed, this is not a conspiracy theory, where the government was going to bomb a plane of, of its own college students, and then blame it on the, I believe it was to actually start a war, I believe with Cuba. And, from there, it's like that's openly acknowledged. And the fact that that was even on the table, I think is incredibly telling and, pretty disturbing.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing, like some of these things get put on as conspiracy theories, right? But there's actual backed up, like, government documentation, right? And it's like, okay, like, but here's the thing, is that people, we like to think of ourselves as rational beings, right? We are not rational beings. We are emotional beings. And so what happens is any type of rational behavior you might have, you have had to fight and claw, tooth and nail in order to be rational. And you will find very few behaviors are rational, right? Like, for instance, me, like, this is just a silly example. It has nothing to do with politics at all. Anytime I'm going to use a spoon or a fork, be it at my house or at a restaurant, I always wipe it off with my fingers, right? I just always, my hands are probably the dirtiest thing, right? Like rationally, I know this, right? Like, I have been touching all kinds of crazy stuff all day, right? And I'll just take my hand and run it right across my fork to clean it, right? There's no way I'm cleaning it, right? I know this. I'm making it dirty. But emotionally, I just have to do it. Because I emotionally feel like I'm cleaning it, right? We're just not rational.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. So, I guess to move to the next topic, for example, for me personally, I have a personal goal to eventually start my own business and become some type of entrepreneur. And it just seems to me that, working for yourself is probably the most common means of actually becoming, truly successful, as opposed to, the 9 to 5, being basically a wage slave. And not to mention, doing work that's actually meaningful to you too. You tend to have more passion for that. And that can be challenging enough in itself. But the government has unquestionably, made getting a business off of the ground and maintaining it a lot harder than it needs to be. And I feel like dealing with the bureaucracy and inefficiency, takes up a lot of the entrepreneur's time and energy than it actually should. So, the government essentially forces businesses to, I think, jump through a lot of hoops just to perform a task that I think is in many cases pretty simple. It kind of reminds me of like the breakfast machine from Pee-wee's Big Adventure, where it's like, they're just making something that should be pretty straightforward. You just have to do so many different tasks to get through it. So basically, what do you think should be done in the case of, small businesses?
So, you done messed up inviting me on this show, because I talk a lot. So, look, let me start here. So, quite often, the perception of libertarians is that we're pro-corporation. And that could not be further from the truth. We typically defend the rights of employers to act how they will, but that's just based off of principle. And I think most libertarians, and some don't realize how bad corporations are, right? Like, there are some that, like, really are just like, I love me my corporations, right? That's right?
Yeah.
But even them, like, if you sat down and went over in detail how the things are run, they'd probably be like outraged immediately, right? Because libertarians understand how the use of force does disturb the market, right? And the government is constantly disturbing our market and interfering. And so there's like this weird perception in society that big corporations are much more efficient than small businesses. And again, nothing can be further from the truth. They are not more efficient, right? Well, they are, right? But they're only more efficient at dealing with government bureaucracy, right? Because that is a huge barrier to entry in all markets. And so Walmart, right, in order to understand in order to comply with the regulation, you have to understand what the regulation is. You have to understand all the ins and outs. It's extremely stressful, right? Just thinking about what if then you don't even know if there's a regulation about something. Wait, is this regulated? Like, how do you even find out if there's a regulation about a certain topic, right? They have regulations about how high stairs have to be, right? But do they have regulations on how wide doors have to be? I don't know. Like, you have to go find that out. Right? And so there's so much anxiety due to just not knowing, so much work going into just complying, right? That it makes being a small business owner or a small business person terrifying and difficult, right? And so what happens is that Walmart or these other big corporations, they just have to do that work one time, basically nationwide. And even if they mess up in one state, because one state has slightly different regulations than another, they'll get the benefit of the doubt and just be like, all right, you got to fix that. And they'll be like, oh, okay. But they just say they need one lawyer. Like, as a small business owner, you need to hire a lawyer to investigate the regulations and all these different intricacies. And Walmart, for their 10,000 locations, needs to hire one lawyer, right? And so that that's much more efficient, right? But if you take away the government forcing people into to comply with these things, right? Suddenly you will see that these giant corporations are not, right? And as you said, it's almost like when I see these giant corporate parks, or I see it's like if you're a manager of a Applebee's, you could own your own bar or restaurant. You have the skills. The only problem is that you don't know how to apply for a liquor license. You don't know how to deal with building regulations. You don't know how to comply with, all these other regulations on food safety and everything. All that causes anxiety. So instead of you dealing with all that stuff on your own, you basically sell your soul to Applebee's. So, hey, I'll run your restaurant and I'll do all this stuff as long as you guys take care of the legal stuff. Right? And it's sad because you would make much more money owning your own restaurant than being a manager of an Applebee's. Right? And on top of that, you would probably pay your staff better. Right? And there would be more restaurants available. So what happens is that we look at income inequality, right, in this country. And a lot of people on the left, I think most people should be upset about income inequality, right? Because, a lot of the riches that a lot of these people make, and I have no problem if you're a billionaire and you've worked your butt off or you've provided enough value. You don't even have to work your butt off. I'm sorry I even use those words. I'm sorry. You don't get paid by how hard you work. You get paid by how much value you provide, right? And so I have no problem if you're like some billionaire that has provided so much value through innovation or whatever, right? I forget his name, Chris Ruffer, iTomato guy. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a libertarian in California, right? He's a libertarian in California. Okay. He's a billionaire. He basically he became a billionaire because he just changed around where they put the machines in tomato processing plants, I guess. And so it made it 40% more efficient just by moving around the machines in the plant. And because he was so much more efficient than his competitors, he was able to take over the entire tomato processing market, basically. And so if you get like packaged tomatoes, they probably came from Chris Roofer, right? And so,
Yes.
and that's the thing, right? Like he might, I don't know it. I know he works hard on liberty stuff. I don't know how hard he's worked, but he's provided tremendous amount of value just by being making that process way more efficient, right? And so it's like, yeah, there are people that have provided value, and we shouldn't criticize those people just because they're rich. But there are a lot of people that get rich off of not creating value, but by leveraging government involvement to their advantage. And it becomes a government-granted monopoly of sorts. When you talk about intellectual property, when we talk about, limited liability things, like when companies pollute, the people that made the decision to pollute don't get in trouble. Like, how does that make any sense? Right?
Exactly.
Like limited liability stuff, and then all these regulations, right? Big businesses love regulations because they typically own the regulators. If you look up the chief regulators in the U.S., like main regulatory agencies, all their resumes are former like CFO of this company or former, like they're all on these giant companies that they're the ones that they're supposed to be regulating, right? And so they're all just bought and paid for. And all those regulators are there is to create an unfair advantage, right? That's why you see Zuckerberg telling Congress, regulate me, please regulate me. Like, because he's afraid that some other social media is going to pop up and wipe Meta off the face of the map. He's seen how many social media companies have come and gone, right? He's seen it. But he knows if they can get good regulations involved in social media, then he'll be there forever.
Exactly, and, that's what I actually do think that, I feel like a lot of the left-wing anarchists who go against I'll say the Rothbardians, not to use the, that AC word, but,
you can say
a lot of them, okay, yeah, ANCAP works.
Try not to identify as that to people outside of the
right. Exactly. I've gotten into plenty of arguments at work that probably could have been avoided easily over that, but, in any case, I feel like a lot of them, are very quick to talk about how, capitalism will just collapse, it can't survive without, the state, when in reality, I would say that what the state is really creating is more of a crony corporatism. And people talk about crony capitalism. I don't personally like that term. I tend to use crony corporatism to kind of differentiate it between what capitalism really should be. I feel like a lot of, left-wing...
I'm sorry.
Okay.
You can continue.
I'm sorry. I was saying... I just feel as though a lot of left-wing anarchists, they make a lot of vague distinctions. For example, in the anarcho-communists, they draw distinctions between personal property and private property. They'll draw distinctions between, what was it going with this? Basically, they'll just create distinctions between, certain things that are kind of unclear. It's kind of vague, could be used in multiple different ways. They talk about capitalism, or they'll say we want free markets, but not necessarily capitalism. And I feel like there's room for, different interpretations based upon these distinctions.
Well, yeah, and this is what I wanted to talk about is this kind of goes back to the semantics, right, and the language, right? And so what happens is that most left libertarians, they ascribe to different definitions of certain words than right libertarians, right? And so what happens is that when you say capitalism, you mean free market, right? When they say capitalism, they mean corporatism. And so you're saying, like, you're telling them, like, I love corporatism in their head, right?
Yeah,
and
that's right.
you hear them saying, I hate the free market.
Yeah.
And so you guys aren't speaking the same language, and then what happens is that, like, it causes a lot of problems because you think like in German, right? If you were, I don't know, if anybody knows German, right? But if I handed you a bottle of wine and I just said gift, right?
Mhm.
Gift means poison in German, right? Yeah, exactly, right? So they're gonna
Yes.
think it's poison, right? And so, the thing is it's like that's exactly what's going on. Is that you're trying to talk about the free market, they're trying to talk about corporatism. I think that you would agree with the statement that corporatism wouldn't exist without the government, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
And so now, if
Lots
you
of
just substitute that word, capitalism wouldn't exist without the government, right?
right.
Now, what
Exactly.
they're saying
They
is
use
you're
them.
right, right? And now you're arguing with them, so they are like, I know I'm right, and he's arguing with me, so he has to be wrong.
Right. Exactly. Right. We end up having two discussions about two completely different things at the end of the day.
And so we're talking past each other. Again, I'm a translator, right? So that's what I did in the army. I translate French and Arabic, right? So when you're a translator, everything, any problem you see is a nail, right? Well, is a problem in translation. When you're a hammer, all you see is nails, right? And so that's my thing. And I really feel like, regardless of me being a translator, that's a main issue in our society. And it's not just in libertarian circles, right? We have our own problems with communication. And we argue over definitions constantly. And it's a semantic argument. Like, that's what a semantic argument is. Don't have semantic arguments. They're completely useless. You cannot agree. Like, you could just say baloney instead of saying capitalism. You'd be just be like, okay, I'm not going to use the word capitalism. I'm going to say baloney to describe a system that does this. All right? Are you opposed to baloney? You know, and then they'll be like, well, no, I'm not opposed to baloney. Everybody loves baloney. And then you'd be like, you see.
Yeah.
Baloney's kind of
I got no beef. I got no beef with baloney.
I don't know how much beef actually in baloney.
I know. It
depends on the baloney. But yeah, you get what I'm saying, right? So,
Sure. So at this point, I kind of wanted to discuss, the Libertarian Party in itself. So to me, I feel as though, to an extent, the Libertarian Party is almost like an oxymoron in a sense, because I feel like what the libertarian ideology represents and what political parties in themselves represent are kind of at odds with each other to an extent. Because libertarianism, from what I've understood, I tend to see it as, minimal state intervention, whereas political parties tend to be representatives of the state. So essentially, when you have, a politician telling you, about how, dangerous the political world can be, there's almost a kind of internal tension there. And I feel like this contributes a lot to how the Libertarian Party, although I see the Libertarian Party as the best party, there is undeniably, I think, a bit of an image issue here. And I feel like that hasn't been helped well by certain, there are certain instances of, libertarians kind of, putting their foot in their mouths, where you've got, Daryl Perry talking about how, oh, you need a license to put toast in your toaster, or, you've got that guy who stripped down on stage at the Libertarian Forum. And people see this and they kind of take away, a negative, impression of it. And I think that this is kind of leading me to is, we basically have a two-party system. And what I find kind of funny is that whenever somebody uses the phrase two-party system, it's pretty much always in a critical, derogatory sense. But that's objectively what it is. We do objectively have a two-party system. So anyway, I think they definitely should have allowed you on the debate stage with the other candidates, and just doing otherwise, ironically kind of treats, I think, third-party candidates like, second-class citizens. So what do you think of that kind of debate setup, and, how do you think that should, change going forward?
Well, I'm not going to talk about the debate setup. Obviously, that was terrible, right? But it's expected. What I do want to talk about is that first thing that you kind of segued it with, right? And that's, we had a guy strip on stage at the 2016 convention. Daryl Perry talked about toasters and toast, which, by the way, I actually know was a good brand.
Yeah, it was good. It was funny.
Yeah, lots of terrible things have happened within the Libertarian Party. Gary Johnson didn't know what Aleppo was, right? I have 3 Leppos. I brush them every day. They're happy. Yep. I feed them. And so, right? But yeah, we've had embarrassing things, right? Happen. But here's the thing. All those things that people point at, those are excuses. There is no reality to those criticisms, right? Because I can point you a million things that the Democrats and Republicans do on a daily basis, right? And nobody points to that being like, oh, I can't vote for Democrats because Nancy Pelosi said that, you know, we have to pass the bill in order to find out what's in it, right? Nobody, like, that's actually the Speaker of the House. That's the way more embarrassing than anything any Libertarian has ever done. Maybe not any Libertarian, but you get the point. Anything that anybody ever talks about. That's way more embarrassing. I have a video on my laptop right now of Hunter Biden getting a foot job while smoking crack. Okay? That came out 2 weeks before the election, right, against Donald Trump, right? We had a guy strip on stage who nobody knew he was going to strip on stage. Democrats knew that the president of the United States had his son was releasing had this video released. Right? Like, that's embarrassing. Virginia, right? The governor of Virginia, right? Dressed up as KKK members in blackface and stuff. Still got reelected, didn't he? Right? So, Democrat, governor of Virginia, right? That's way more embarrassing than anything that has ever taken place. Republicans. Do I even need to bring up things? I mean... We had Trump as president for 4 years, right?
Wanted to nuke what are you doing, a nuke a hurricane or something?
Yeah, there's so many things that you can, there are some elected Republicans that have just said wild things. And so it's like, look, no, I mean, that stuff is excuses, right? So, and this goes into the paradigm, right? Is that emotionally, it's not a rational criticism of the Libertarian Party, right? Emotionally, people, they don't want to accept that voting for Republican or voting for Democrat was really a bad thing that they did in their life, right? If you supported Obama, you have blood on your hands. If you supported Trump, you have blood on your hands. If you supported almost any politician, Republican or Democrat, throughout your entire life, that person is probably responsible for some very horrible things while they were in office. And that is the reality, right? And so what happens is that when libertarians show people the horrors of that stuff, they have to come up with a reason why they would have done it, right? There has to be a reason. I had to vote for Obama because in 2012. I voted for Obama in 2007. I didn't vote for him in 2012. But he was talking about peace in 2007. He won a Nobel Peace Prize. And then he went on to drop a bomb every 8 minutes of his presidency. He bombed another Nobel Peace Prize winner. Like, it's crazy. Right? He bombed Doctors Without Borders. Right? He assassinated American citizens. Right? And then changed the law after he did it so that it wouldn't be illegal anymore. Right? Like, it's absolutely crazy what Obama did. Right? Obama in 2007 campaigned to give habeas corpus to suspected terrorists in Guantanamo Bay, which was admirable. He never did that. But in his first term, he took away every American's right to a trial, right? He took away. You no longer have a right to trial in the United States because of Obama, right? As long as you are suspected of being a terrorist, you do not have a right to trial anymore, right? Obama signed that, right? And so that's the thing, right? Is that you had to vote for Obama, right? So people have to we use our rational minds to calm down our emotions. And so when faced with all that horror, right, you have to say, well, I had to vote for Obama because in 2012 because Mitt Romney was just so much worse. Mitt Romney would have done worse things. We all know that. He probably wouldn't, right? I think Mitt Romney's, as far as politicians go, isn't so horrible. Still really bad. This is not an endorsement of Mitt Romney, but compared to Obama, what we know of him, But anyway, so people say that. But you could have voted for Gary Johnson, or you could have just not voted in 2012, right? But now they have to say, oh, no. But you see, libertarians, they're jokes. They had a guy strip on stage, so I couldn't have voted for Gary Johnson, right? And this is how people rationalize it. It's an emotional crutch to allow them to continue without thinking of themselves as bad people, right? But I'm sorry, you're not a bad person if you voted for Republicans and Democrats, but you did very bad things, right? Supporting a Republican or a Democrat, regardless of the situation, throughout history. And again, you have to look at it as a case-by-case basis. There might be some Republican or Democrat never did anything wrong, right? Ron Paul might be a good example of that, right? Although I think he did vote for the Iraq War, right? No, he voted for the Afghanistan War, right? And so, yeah, I mean, look, all these people have blood on their hands, and so they just use this to emotionally soothe themselves. And so, yeah, that would probably be one of the last things I want to talk about. My phone's about to die.
Well, I understand. Honestly, that is I'm very happy to hear that answer. I feel like that, just very glad to hear that, I mean, I was actually tweeting something very similar to that, on the election day, talking about how, people can say, there's some type of image issue with the libertarians, but that is nothing at all compared to the image, issues that you see with, Republicans and Democrats. And furthermore, we have to make a distinction too between, image's appearance, the superficial, the surface, and there's also what something actually is. And we can't even scratch the surface of how horrible, the Republican and Democratic parties are and, what they've accomplished in society or what they've, taken away from that. But, and anyway, going back to the whole, I just want to make a quick point about that debate situation I was saying here. They're always trying to keep, it seems like they often keep libertarians off of the debate stage. So, I was watching, Shane Hazel, the libertarian candidate out in Georgia. They messed up letting him on stage with, the others because, you've got, just one example of a highlight I saw was Stacey Abrams was talking about gun control, and he was able to skillfully turn around and say, for the past recent few years, the most common, purchaser of firearms has been minority women, and she had no response for that. I mean, that completely shut her up. So it's I think it's great when we have, people out there who can really, advocate well for liberty and, make a good case for it, because people are always saying, vote for the lesser of two evils. It's that, which I think is a horrible statement. I mean, why not go for something, like a third party who is not an evil to begin with, is essentially, my mentality on it.
Yeah, I mean, and again, here's the thing, and I would like to close with this, is that libertarians need to do the work. And so what happens is that we become discouraged. It's very easy. Being a libertarian, which just means almost at this point paying attention. But being a libertarian is emotionally draining, right? It's emotionally draining. It's horrible. We live in such an authoritarian world, which libertarianism's the opposite of authoritarianism on a spectrum, right? And so the less libertarianism you have, the more authoritarianism you have. And I like to actually always say that to people that aren't libertarians, because it forces them into that paradigm, right? And so now they're like, so now I'm making a case for authoritarianism in this situation, right? And that's always the case. That isn't like some Jedi mind trick. That is just the reality of the situation. The less libertarianism you have, the more authoritarianism you have. The less authoritarianism you have, the more libertarianism you have. But basically, it's very stressful. Like you see horrible things going on that other people just don't seem to notice, right? And so we get really upset, and then we see the giant the state and all the horrible things it does, and how much power it has, and it can almost make you feel like powerless, right? In comparison, like, how am I supposed to fight this, right? What am I going to do, right? And the thing is that the state's power is almost entirely an illusion, right? It's almost entirely illusion. It looks a lot bigger and scarier than what it actually is. And all it takes is for us to do the work and not be intimidated, right? And a big part of that intimidation that we see is libertarians criticizing other libertarians instead of criticizing the state. Right. There's nothing a libertarian, another self-identified libertarian, has done that compares to anything that the state has done. It's not a drop in the bucket. I don't care how many terrible names they've called you. I don't care what kind of terrible jokes they might have said, right? It doesn't compare to the actual genocide going on in Yemen right now. It doesn't compare to the COVID regime and the millions of people that these lockdowns murdered, right? Millions. Oh, tens of millions of people are dead now because of those lockdowns. It doesn't compare. And so we need to put aside our differences. If you don't like a libertarian, just ignore them. Keep your head down, put your nose to the grindstone, and do the work. I came up with a term a while back called hecklertarian. It's any self-described libertarian that spends more time criticizing the activism of other libertarians than they do on their own activism, right? And we have a lot of hecklertarians. We have a lot of them. It doesn't have one-on-one conversations, peaceful conversations, not arguments, right? Try to speak other people's languages as opposed to trying to force definitions down their throat. Start a podcast. I don't suggest that one for most people, but that seems to be the popular thing to do. And so a podcast is better than no podcast. Start a blog. Start injecting yourself into non-libertarian spaces and be the representative of the libertarian movement, right? All these things. Call into radio shows when they're talking about politics. Open up with, well, I'm a libertarian, so, right? And give your perspective on it, right? Like, all these things are ways that we can start pushing the needle, right? Going on Facebook and like laughing at the failure of some other libertarian doesn't help anything, right? Going on Facebook and being like, well, that guy, he has bad messaging. Well, then show him what good messaging looks like. Go out and do it, right? And that's why I would just urge all libertarians, anybody watching this, if you're not a libertarian or you think that you might be a libertarian, definitely reach out. You can contact me. My website's still up, eliferrari.com. Or you can reach out to Evan, I'm sure. Right, and just start a conversation, ask questions, see how you can get involved. It's not as difficult as it might seem. Very small things turn into big things very quickly.
Yes, Very beautifully said. Thank you so much for coming on, Elijah. I really do appreciate that, and I do wish the best going forward for you and for the Libertarian Party of Rhode Island as well, and for Libertarian Party in general as well. So to everybody out there, I want to say thanks for tuning in. This has been Evan Morgan of Morgan Meets the Eye. Make sure to follow on social media, subscribe, comment, and above all, keep asking why. So thanks again for coming on, and everybody have a great day. Bye-bye now, folks.
Be excellent to each other, everybody.